Thank you, Chris, and thank you all. If Ryan Burge could create a graph that reflected the population of EPN, Friday would look as if we were having a bit of a collapse, of course. And if we were to break it down by demographics, you know that it would be the missing generation would be the rectors, because they all still think, despite Tuesday to Friday, they have to leave before the conference finishes. It's sort of one of the... But thank you to those who are in any of these categories, or to all of you for still being here. I come from the future. Don't tiptoe to the door. You can hear this in my voice, because what I mean by that is that I come from Australia. And no, I'm not trying to make any point about sort of the wonderful things that I'd like to convince you about with regard to my homeland. I'm telling you about the role of religion in Western society and about the advance of the secular. I was born into an Australian social life which was already experiencing in the 1960s some of the things which people in the United States were only going to start experiencing in the 1980s and 90s. In Australia, some of the trends that you've seen, things that were similar to the graphs that Ryan and our discussants of the previous session discussed, some of those things were happening already in the 60s the way they have been happening in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. I want to tell you a little bit more about my own story, because it may be relevant to some of the other things I have to say. I am a priest of the Anglican Church of Australia. I'm the child of a rectory. I studied, of course, in schools in Australia, and then studied classics and ancient history at the University of Western Australia before going to Trinity College in Melbourne to seminary, which is a place I later became the head of before coming to Yale. I was already interested and felt a passion and a calling to be involved in theological education, being a somewhat nerdy person, but I was also convinced that it wasn't sufficient for me to bring the virtues of Greek paradigms to the table when I was thinking about training those who were preparing for ordination and ministry in the church. I rather had to actually go and get some of my own experience. To be honest, those of you who've grown up in PK sort of environments know that, at least in terms of socialization, you've got a bit of a head start in terms of knowing some of the difficult things that you're going to deal with, as well as some of the positives. I was a parish priest for almost 7 years. I was a curate and then rector of a parish in a growing suburban area on the outskirts of Perth in Western Australia. I think most of my students think that all I did was to parse Greek verbs, but I was actually the rector of a parish which had not yet built a building for itself. It had been meeting in a local hall, and we began in my ministry there by building the building that was become the permanent home of that parish church. And then after 2 years, we determined that we would plant a second church in the next door suburban area. And by the time I finished, we'd built the second building and created a second parish there. So I am, yes, I'm kind of making my church planter credentials here, because I think sometimes the zero-sum game thinking that we engage in the church, as well as everywhere else, thinks that if somebody knows something about patristic theology, they can't possibly know anything about church planting. But actually, I was there too. I was thinking all the time, though, about the fact that I still felt a calling to theological education, and through some networking and mentoring and so forth, I determined that I would come to this country. The first time I landed in this country was in 1992. For much of my sort of seminary formation and the time as a parish priest, I'd been thinking that the PhD that I ought to earn was really to do with what we might call, broadly speaking, liberation theology. I'm deeply immersed and committed to the intellectual currents of the ways in which the church has learned from and engaged with people in all different parts of the world who are thinking about how the gospel of Jesus is not simply for personal belief and religion, but for social transformation. And I had quite a bit to do with the church in Asia through that period as a parish priest. I was involved in the Asian ecumenical movement. But a series of circumstances, including the death of my seminary mentor, who'd been a classicist and a patristic scholar, led me to sort of look hard in the theological mirror and decide that I had to go back to the ancient church as well, in order to be one of those people who might help to resource the church thinking about itself from that point of view. But there was another reason for that shift of mentality that really had to do more with my experience as a parish priest. I was labouring, even though, as you've heard, at least by some measures, labouring in a way that was bearing fruit that would even show up on a graph. I was conscious that I was living and working in what was effectively now the secular wilderness. Because in effect, the 1990s that I was working into in Australia were demographically somewhat more like the last decade or so in the United States. That's my futurological claim, so to speak. And I became convinced, not just purely by inspiration or by my own ideas, that we needed to think more seriously about the character of a Christian church which was not dependent upon the social privilege of the Constantinian era. That Christendom had in effect gone, and that the ways in which Christian identity was going to be expressed had to involve the claim of a particularity which involved a kind of tension that we had not been used to between the way in which Christian identity worked and the ways in which the broader assumptions of the social setting in which we were placed worked. And you can probably also hear, without me going into it too much, that was actually quite closely linked with my interest in liberation theology. In other words, there was this sense in which we had to recover the characteristic peculiarity of forms of Christian community which could maintain a critical pose relative to the rest of society, because quite frankly, we weren't going to be given any choice. To simply imagine that the trends of the past, the forms of privilege, the forms of associational connection that had previously been able to give the church a place in Australian society were disintegrating rapidly. And so that took me on my academic journey the way I went. But I landed, of course, in this country. In fact, I landed in South Bend, Indiana for 4 years. And I discovered that I had indeed gone back to the past. Now, there are lots of jokes about Indiana in that, but I had a lovely time at South Bend. That, of course, means the University of Notre Dame. And you can probably imagine why studying the ancient church and its practices and so forth made sense in that context. But what I mean by going back to the past was that I was absolutely astonished to discover the depth and the centrality of American religiosity. That people went to church. And of course, in the immediate Notre Dame context, that was hardly surprising. But I discovered that in my experience of the Episcopal Church in northern Indiana as well, a period of time for which I'm very grateful. And I want to mention, to lament him, that my parish priest and mentor in that time was Dabney Smith, who was the rector of St. Michael Little Angels in South Bend, but some of you would have met perhaps in Louisiana or Southwest Florida, where he'd been bishop, who died just late last year. So I found myself in a place that was in a completely different historic moment, or at least so it seemed. But what I didn't know, and you've actually just had a bit of a primer on some of that, was that I'd landed at the time when the measurable collapse of the arrival of the 18 to 35-year-old demographic into American Christianity, it was that graph was just starting to go down. Yes, it was me. Of course, that wasn't self-evident in 1992 because those processes were really just beginning. And it was a certain level of cognitive dissonance for me in just seeing how religious Americans were. They went to one church or another, or to a synagogue, or to whatever the place was that seemed to be an entirely normal thing. And, I must say I loved it. I could, wear my collar in the supermarket and not get looked at weirdly. That was not my experience in Australia of the 80s and 90s. It's probably getting not to be the experience of you in 2025, right? There's something else I should say about Australia. Australia was never a particularly religious country, even at the top of its game, shall we say. There was a 19th century observer who travelled to Australia and wrote back to the UK and said it's the most godless place under heaven. Now, it's actually pretty nice, but what he meant by that was that religious practice was not deeply embedded there. And there were a couple of reasons for that. You can probably work them out. If you found a colony, displaced Indigenous people, and the people that you put there instead are not religious refugees or respectable plantation owners or whatever, but rather the offscouring of your society because you can't send them to colonies in this part of the world anymore. You start with convicts and then you start with opportunistic gold diggers who are in effect economic refugees like my Irish forebears. Religion was never really the kind of central cultural force that it was in this country. Nevertheless, Australia did have religious institutions, does have religious institutions. You can go to its great cities and there are big Anglican cathedrals in the middle of them for reasons that are historically easily explicable. And yet Australia had also gone through a couple of waves of secular paradigm shifts, as it were, even before the time that I'm talking about. One of them had to do with the Great War, as it was known. I'm thinking about this looking out the window of my hotel room, like some of you seeing that extraordinary museum here in Kansas City to the First World War, as it's known. Australians went to the First World War in great number and paid enormous prices for an uncritical allegiance to the geopolitical desires of Great Britain and its empire at that time. The numbers who went were hundreds of thousands. The casualties were massive. The impact upon the Australian psyche of campaigns like Gallipoli, which is the most famous of them, the one that got a movie made about it, that was enormously important for Australians. Perhaps worse and more important were the experiences of Australians on the Western Front during the last couple of years of the war, where one of my own great uncles, whom of course I never met, was killed after having tried to desert twice. A hellish kind of landscape. And the number of Australians who died or were wounded and permanently disabled in the First War caused, even in Australia at such a great distance from the war, as of course in the UK and in France and in Germany, a whole range of quite deep questions about the nature of the world itself, in which religion was among those things that was placed under scrutiny. Now, religion didn't collapse after the First World War, but intellectual currents of criticism and so forth took on a new kind of significance from that point onwards. But it wasn't really until the 1960s, at least as far as the graphs that I could, but I'm not going to bother you showing you from Australia, would track. It's not until the 1960s that we see that kind of immediate downward trend where fewer people come to church, fewer children are baptised, disappearing generations start to appear. It's about 20 to 30 years ahead of the process that you're familiar with here. We heard in the last session, for those of you who were there, some really interesting conversation and some interesting statistics, including the possibility that there is a kind of a stalling moment going on here in that downward trend for religious observance and even for young people in particular. And I think that's all really interesting and important. I want to say a couple of things that are going to sound pessimistic about that, although I'm here, by the way, just as a subtext, I'm here to persuade you to be pessimistic and hopeful rather than to be optimistic and desperate, okay? You see, even if that trend, particularly with regard to young people's connection and participation, which, by the way, I benefit from every day when I go downstairs to my chapel and I sit with 40 or 50 people younger than me and pray the daily office together. I mean, it's heaven. Just go to a seminary if you want to go to a place where you have this sense of how youth is indeed kicking back. It's true. But even if that trend were to be reversed, better for Matthew or for Molly or Ryan to say this than me, but even if the trend were reversed, that's not actually going to save us, because the missing generation is already missing. And you might have seen in one of the graphs that they showed you in the last session that it's not just those sort of younger adults, anyone almost below 65 that's missing. There's been this reduplicating effect because their children aren't there either. So it's the signs of hope that we see going on in certain forms of statistics need, I think, to be analysed down to one further level, which I think some of these good friends could probably do in a way that I'm not capable of. But let me put it to you this way. There are actually two different stories going on in the experience of secularization and the decline of religion in the Episcopal Church. There are a lot more than two, but I think two is a useful conceptual way of thinking about it. There are places which are declining very rapidly, and, well, let's say three. There are places that are holding their own, and there are places that are growing and reviving and so forth. I think EPN's often a place where we come together to be with other people who are really determined to ensure that there is revival and renewal and growth and so forth, and that's great. But, you know, sometimes the graphs are actually deceptive because they average out the places that are aging and dying and the places that are actually holding their own and coming back up. You see, if we take out the places that are holding their own and the places that are in renewal, the line of collapse is actually much worse than the graphs suggest. And again, I have no real reason to pull out a figure about this, but if we're not prepared for the fact that half or more than half of the churches that we currently have are going to close in the next 20 years, we're not really paying attention. Now, there are going to be people doing good and holy work with those places, by the way, the places that are going to close. But I won't apologise for having a bit more interest, just because of where I am and what I do, in the people who are looking to find the ways to seek renewal and so forth. I mean, God's loving purpose is with dying churches as well as with growing ones, let's be clear. But that doesn't mean that we're called to become a culture or an institution that's focused on how churches die. But I think that we are called to be people who understand that the ways in which churches might live and grow and be renewed is not to put our finger in the dike to stop this. I mean, this is a mixed metaphor now, but it's all got water in it, okay? Putting our fingers in the dike in the hope that the secular tsunami will stop flowing over us. We're only in the middle of it. There's a long way to go, even before the trend that we're already seeing established for us in these evidential terms is really going to have its full impact. It's going to get worse before it gets better, if you want to look at it at that complete national stage kind of way. In 2018, I think it was, I was invited by the leadership of what was, I think, on the cusp of becoming EPN from SEEP to talk to a group of leaders there, and some of you may have even been there, where I gave a talk called Failing and Flourishing, which was trying to suggest that, in fact, we needed to understand that it's not just about how things are going down in a sort of moderately depressing way, but that they're simultaneously collapsing and growing again. And while that's something I think you can observe from statistics and evidence, the real significance of that, I think, is that it's actually got a theological kind of map embedded there, isn't it? This challenge before us is not about stemming the tide, it's about death and resurrection. I think that one of the consequences of how rapidly this has all overtaken the United States, and here I am sort of claiming a kind of privileged position as someone who's come and gone 3 times across the past 30 years. I've spent roughly half my ministry in Australia and the US between those points. I'm so enormously grateful to the Episcopal Church and to so many of you who have become my friends and colleagues for the ways in which I've been welcomed. I've always chosen to remain a priest of the Australian Church, though, by the way, because you know there are things I can get away with saying when I maintain that. Matthew Price knows exactly what I mean. You know, you'll listen to things from us that you might balk at from others. But one of the things I want to tell you is that I think that the experience of the rapid collapse has caused us to sort of engage in various forms of cognitive dissonance within the Episcopal Church, because we're still trying to work out how on earth this happened, how this happened so rapidly, what went wrong, what did we do wrong. So I have a piece of good news for you. It's not your fault. I think that's probably worth pondering, that because, of course, many of us in our lifetimes have seen things that make the church seem as if it's become weaker, and indeed it has, and so forth, that we think, what did we do wrong? What did we do wrong? Now, I want to share with you a few versions of the false narratives that we've offered ourselves about this. And I'm going to soften you up by giving you a few that you can all chuckle at, even a bit uncomfortably, right? Because you know who these people are and they're not you, but they exist. It was all fine until we brought in the new prayer book. Okay, next one. I got away with that. All right. It was all fine until we started ordaining women. Now, you know, those are uncomfortable things to say. The people who say them still exist. It's just that they're not in our ranks anymore. And, of course, third and maybe most significant is it was all fine until we started being fully inclusive of, you know, gay and lesbian and queer folks and so forth. None of those things are true, even at the level of demography, right? Let's be clear about that. Now, and I wanted to be clear also about the fact that something's theological value and truth is not necessarily correlated with its significance for demography. But nevertheless, it is simply wrong at any level to say that, well, we were fine until we started doing this one thing that I didn't like in the past. Now, now I'm going to get more uncomfortable about it, because we all play these games, you see, and sometimes those games are, things that are false explanations, like the ones I just showed you. You might take a moment just to say, all right, what is the explanation that I am harbouring at the moment about how all the things that someone else did or didn't do are the reason that we're in this position? And just to cut to the chase, none of them are true. None of them are true. The secular tsunami did not take place in the Episcopal Church because of any decision of the General Convention or by any cultural trend that pre-existed in the Episcopal Church, because it's not an Episcopalian phenomenon. It's a religious phenomenon. But here's the uncomfortable part. I've heard, over the years, quite a few examples. If those other ones were historic and explanatory, the versions that are programmatic. If only you would listen to me, everything will be fine. All right, this is going to be more uncomfortable. If only we fixed all this exclusive language in the prayer book, people would come to church. Now, that's not a theological argument about how the language of the prayer book should be. It's just that it's not relevant to it, right? I heard a quite well-known, distinguished Episcopalian theologian last year basically say to a group of us involved in theological education, if only we talked more about politics in the churches, people would come, because that's what they want. Now, we might, by the way, have to talk about politics. We are, I will say, and I think they're recording this, so I'm stuck now. We are in the middle of an unfolding coup at the moment. We are facing incipient fascism now. I'm not going to pretend that that isn't the case. Now, I'm saying this to my students too, by the way, and in case any of you are scared to hire them, I'm also telling them that you can't just necessarily get up in front of every group and say that in exactly the same way. But it's true, okay? Those things are true. But the fact that we need to think carefully with the members of our parishes about political witness does not mean that people are going to start coming to church again if we do that. It's more likely, of course, to cause problems. A former student of mine preached a very thoughtful sermon the week after Bishop Buddy's sermon, when, of course, the week, you may remember, the Sunday after that was Jesus in the Nazareth synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He sent me to bring good news to the poor. If you didn't preach the gospel in a way that pissed somebody off at that point, you're not doing your job. But, of course, there was one person in that relatively purple parish that walked out and resigned from the parish and isn't coming back. That's not a good thing. Let's be clear. But it doesn't mean that he wasn't right to preach the sermon, just as Bishop Buddy wasn't right to preach the sermon. And the response, those who make the response have to be responsible for their own actions. I've got two more for you. Have I made some people uncomfortable yet? Once again, this isn't about the question of the value or the inherent significance of the questions. It's about the ways in which we have a tendency to kid ourselves into thinking that if only people would do the things I wanted to, everything would be fine. So here are the other two more. If only we listened more to the young people. Now, we do actually need to listen more to the young people, by the way. But again, that's not actually a panacea. And last but not least, if only we were less concerned with this stuff like creeds, and Jesus and Christian specifics. If only we could just appeal to people in the sense that there's a kind of innate spirituality in everybody. And of course we have ritual and so forth because, ritual is so meaningful, isn't it? I tell you, if I had $1 for that, every time somebody had said meaningful, as if it were meaningful, I wouldn't have to run a capital campaign. I mean, that is a great indictment of our moment, that there is so little sense of meaning that to offer people things that have any meaning is somehow seen to be a positive. I'm not interested in offering people any meaning. I'm interested in offering people the gospel. And I think And I think we have reason to do that, which is primarily theological, of course, and yet which might also have some positive significance with the challenge that's facing us in trying to be members of a church which is seeking its way through these difficult moments. So what was it that changed everything? As I've come and gone over the years, I wondered for a while whether the events of 9/11 actually had a particular part in this. And, you know, it was just after that we had the big flush of the paperback atheists who also got mentioned in the last session. I think that the 9/11 events gave a certain freedom to various forms of racism that were encoded under the guise of religious critique, because that's really as much of what those things were, was racism, as anything to do with the philosophical question of the existence of God. But I was wrong, because we didn't have all the statistics in 2001 as to what had been happening in that previous decade. It had really begun before that. And I think that the secular tsunami in its beginnings plus 9/11 gave rise to a new cultural moment in which religiosity could be seen with a new kind of suspicion, and which Muslims in particular, of course, were the victims of that kind of racist anti-religiosity. But that wasn't the reason. And, you know, despite Harris and Dawkins and so forth, it wasn't really about God anyway, was it? It was about religion. It was about religion. And I think this is important for us to remember, and we probably do all know this, but let me say it again. You know, people have been unclear about the God question for quite a while now. I mean, there was this thing called the Enlightenment, you know, and then there have been sort of the various extraordinary and important critiques offered by Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and so forth, you know, each of which has something to teach us. The God question didn't come up in the 1990s, and it wasn't because of that the 18 to 35 started falling off in the 1990s. They didn't sort of suddenly wake up and think, well, this whole notion of theism doesn't make any sense to me anymore. The thing that happened, I think, was how late-stage capitalism had started to form our hearts and minds in ways that gave rise to a different set of understandings about how we connect with associations and institutions. See, it wasn't just in that period that religion started to go off the boil and worse. Think about any kind of social institution that was based on associational membership for people to come together to do particular things. They've all gone into really difficult kinds of historic moments. I mean, think about uniformed, you know, scouting groups, that kind of stuff. I mean, the Rotary Club makes the Episcopal Church look like a bunch of bright young things these days. Late-stage capitalism, I think, reached an inflection point at which it didn't seem obvious to young people that in order to seek whatever it was they thought was true, whether they were people who were spiritually minded or not, that associational membership and institutional affiliation had any particular relevance to it. And so here you see, that's worth pondering. It isn't just a sort of a straightforward gimme that gives us an answer to what goes forward. But I think that late-stage capitalism has reached a point where it's persuaded us all that we are our own individual consumers of everything in such a way that we should be able to curate. Curate goes in the same wastebasket as meaningful, by the way, for me, just so you know. So that we should be able to curate a kind of religious identity for ourselves. That why should institutions and associations which don't map completely onto my personal sense of how I am indeed the divinity who proceeds through the world of consumption in the way that I want to, why should they be the things that actually tell me the way I ought to feel about anything? So the problem wasn't really with God, it was with institutions. And even then, not just with institutions, I think, but with associational commitment. So all those entities waned. And what I think happened was the creation of the consuming self reached a certain kind of inflection point where it began to allow us to determine that the ways in which we wanted to be ourselves didn't have to be formed through those sorts of membership requirements. So, just to prove to you that I've been in the United States for a while, 2 roads diverged in a wood. These things made a lot more sense to me once I lived in New England for a few years, but anyway. Anglicanism has a complex relationship with the status quo, and I think that we are indeed at a point where there's a kind of a fork in the road for how we're going to take the questions that are placed before us by the current circumstances, which way we're going to go. And here's something paradoxical for you. I suspect that we're going to take both the roads at once, but I don't think that they necessarily have equal theological value or will have equal success. But let me say why. We have a complex relationship with the status quo. I mean, we came out of being a state church, an established church in the English model. And even though, American Episcopalians will sign on with all the verve that any other American will to the opposition to the notion of, establishment and making sure that church and state are separate, I have to say to you, I don't understand that for a minute. But it doesn't mean that I'm in favour of what people would call theocratic governments and so forth, but nevertheless. We have a charism, we could say, from a positive point of view, we have a charism of placing ourselves in positions where we can be a sort of chaplaincy service to the status quo. I mean, that's what the National Cathedral is about. That's why Marion Buddy got to preach that sermon. Of course, the sermon itself showed up the fissures that exist in that process to the point that I doubt that it will happen again in exactly that kind of way. But there's no shame in the fact that we have to acknowledge that we have all these forms of strong historic engagement with the culture that we ought to be able to leverage and so forth. But you see, the choice that we face now, this is perhaps going back to Constantine and Christendom now, the choice that we have to face now is about rediscovering a sense of authenticity and an identity which is not based upon that established past, or on the other hand, deciding that what we really care about is having the kind of privilege and the kind of immediate connection with all the cultural movements that we've been so used to, that we follow it down that track. Now, we've all gotten so used to beating up on Constantine and upon the notion of Christendom in the past 20 or 30 years that that's going to sound like the easiest thing in the world to most of you. But it's not. Because the ways in which chaplaincy to the regime works these days isn't just Christian nationalism. I mean, Christian nationalism absolutely has to be placed in its own abhorrent little theological framework for a minute, but it's not really my theme today. You see, if you think that the church ought to adapt itself to the point of becoming the provider of spiritual care to the United States of 2025 going forward, then that's about the most Christendom-y thing you could ever say. Because it isn't about political compromise, it's about cultural and social compromise. By the way, I have to say as an aside that I have a genuinely enormous admiration and respect for those who engage in the work in hospitals, in institutions, in hospice care and so forth. But I have to say at the same time that swallowing the concept of spiritual care as the price to get into those places is a very high price to pay. Because if you don't think that everything in God's world is spiritual, then accepting the secular assumption, because it is exactly the assumption of the secular, which tells you that we can have economics and we can have politics and we can have medical care and we can have spiritual care, stay in your lane, then we have sold the birthright of God's sovereignty in the world for the mess of pottage, which is the notion of spirituality. The notion of spirituality, I mean, either spirituality is a way of talking about who we are about everything in the world, or it's not worth talking about. I mean, fast food is a kind of spirituality. Public transport is a kind of spirituality. Fascism is a kind of spirituality. Did I say fascism? Sorry, just... So the two roads at the moment are that of doing whatever seems necessary to continue as chaplains to American society and hope that that will save us even as the numbers keep plummeting. So it's not really doing so well, is it? Or claiming Christian identity as something that exists outside of national projects and recovering the notion that our fundamental citizenship, forgive me for saying this as a resident alien, I'm a green card holder, but claiming the necessity of understanding that our citizenship is in the heavens, which does not mean being less concerned about material and social political realities, far from it. It means taking our script from the practice of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus, the nature of God's reign in the world, rather than that of those who would place themselves increasingly without embarrassment as alternatives to the God whose world this genuinely is. You may sort of think, well, of course, if Trump hadn't been elected, we wouldn't have to say that stuff. But actually, we do have to say that stuff. And of course, there is no moral equivalence between, you know, the alternative candidate and Trump and so forth. There is no equivalence here. But bear in mind that inequality in this country has marched on inexorably right through the 1980s and 90s and into this decade. That inequality across 8 years of Barack Obama's reign, a person of much greater integrity and even obviously of faith. Nevertheless, the poorest in the United States got poorer through those 8 years, not less poor. The fact that we're in such a terrible moment at this point should not stop us from seeing that the call at the moment is to establish a different kind of citizenship, a different kind of understanding about who we might be. I've had to say that again, though, and I will, that will probably take both forks at once, because there are other ways in which the fact that we have a particular kind of historically inherited set of assumptions and privileges is not something to be taken lightly. I mean, I'm not saying pull the National Cathedral down at this point. I mean, I don't know what it will be quite for in the civic realm after the Buddy sermon. It's going to be different. So I'm not saying that at all. We have to actually leverage all the privileges that are being given to us. I mean, the problem with privilege is refusing to acknowledge that you have it. It's what you do with privilege once you've acknowledged that you have it, rather than saying, well, that's a position of privilege and therefore I won't look at it anymore. I mean, if you're in this room, you've got a considerable bag of privilege hanging with you. What are we going to do with it? I want to mention that one of the interesting resources for helping us think about identity in the post-Christendom reality is actually the Book of Common Prayer. This may surprise you, but this is where you're going to have to get 5 minutes of Dean McGowan's prayer book class, right? Because that's part of what I do, but it is actually related to the ancient world as well. The prayer book is, of course, a product of the 19th and 20th century liturgical movement, very different in ethos from the prayer books of 1928 and its predecessors, despite the fact of the Tudor language popping up in Rite 1 and so forth. Now, the BCP was being formed before the secular tidal wave had come along, admittedly, but the intellectual movement that gave rise to it owed quite a bit to the ways in which European theologians had been thinking after the First World War and the challenges that they were experiencing about how to think about religious identity in that new kind of environment. And many of you do know this, if you think about it, that what's most striking about the 79 book is not the use of contemporary language, even though that's very striking. It's actually the fact that the theological assumptions embedded in the way it presents the sacraments are those of the 4th century church, not the 16th century church. And that is actually a gift to us that we may choose at this point to make use of if we feel that we might actually go back to a church which is not primarily driven by its sense of chaplaincy to the current culture, but has a different kind of identity which is focused more upon the distinctiveness of that entity that was just starting to negotiate its place relative to people like Constantine. So the two paths that we have are of accommodation, and we will accommodate in some ways, and perhaps even in some ways we should, but the other path is that of renewal. Not a path of trying to dig our heels in as the graphs sort of go towards something like zero. They're not really going to go to zero, by the way. No, sometimes you may have seen stories like this whereby, if the current trends can continue, the Episcopal Church will be extinct by 2050. There are people in this room who will be alive in 2050. So, that's actually not how it works. But it does help to remind us that what we need to go forward is not a sense of digging our heels in to reverse the decline. What we need going forward is resurrection. That's the character of the gospel. So we should be seeking converts. We should be seeking growth. We should be seeking to make an impact. But we should not be doing so that we can revert the secular decline. We should be doing so because this is resurrection territory that we're in now. In November 2016, a fateful month, I was pondering the outcome of that election, and I was pondering some of my students' responses to it, and I guess there was a sense in which I felt that some students felt that they had been betrayed by the American project at that point. You know, that the things that they ought to have been able to hope from it were lacking, you know, that they'd been lost. There was every reason to be upset, I think, from many people's point of view. I get that completely. But I was a bit struck by how much I realized that there were many students of quite progressive mind who really thought, I'm sorry, this wasn't his greatest moment, but he didn't say this originally himself, that, you know, the moral arc of the universe, you know, and the way it was bending. By the way, Dr. King didn't, you know, invent that notion, which is one of the reasons I'd let him off the hook about it, because the notion that what we're dealing with is an arc, you know, sailing gracefully towards a particular end is frankly not the case. It's not how the reign of God works. The reign of God breaks into history in discontinuity with the way in which we actually establish and understand trends to be working. Anyway, a few days after that election, St. Martin's Day was coming along. St. Martin's Day is what day, everyone? November 11th. A day which has been co-opted in various ways by civil religion in the 20th century. More benignly initially as Armistice Day, which was its original form, because of course it was on St. Martin's Day that the armistice at the end of the Great War was signed. And part of the reason it was chosen, even in that period, was because Martin was a patron of France and of course the soldier who had laid down his arms. I have to say, without any disrespect to veterans, that to turn the Armistice Day into Veterans Day is a travesty. That day was meant to commemorate all the war dead, combatant and non-combatant, of whatever side, and to express the hope that war would not happen again. And so the thing that we should be thanking veterans for is for laying down their arms. That's what a Christian view of how November 11th should work. Anyway, November 11th came along that year, and I found myself reflecting about Martin and thinking this is the moment at which we have to think about a different kind of understanding about how power works in the secular sphere than just bemoaning the fact that we don't have the power that we want in the secular sphere. And my students in the room can attest to the fact that most days since November the 11th, 2016, I've been wearing my Martin of Tours medal, San Martin Caballero, as he is known, of course, to some other good folk in our midst. You probably heard the story about Martin dividing his cloak with the beggar at the gate of Amiens. You know, and Christ appears to him in a dream, talking to the angels, and said, "Look, Martin, he's only a catechumen, but he's clothed me." Extraordinary story. But the one story about Martin I want to share with you is that he, of course, is one of those famous 4th century bishops who got dragged into the episcopate. I think we should be looking about reviving that sort of mode of episcopal election, by the way. If anyone wants to be a bishop, it's actually a pretty bad sign relative to the discernment. But I'm thankful for them, nevertheless, really, and I mean that genuinely. But Martin was sort of hoodwinked into becoming a bishop. And then during his episcopacy, the Bishop of Avila in Spain, that's the same Avila as Teresa, whom you know much better from 1,000 years later, named Priscillian, fell into heresy. And Priscillian taught all sorts of weird stuff, and he needed to be sort of kept at arm's length. And the other bishops of the time said, hey, we've got this new established relationship with the Roman Empire. Let's use the secular power to deal with Priscillian. They had him tried, and they had him executed, Priscillian. Martin, who opposed Priscillian's theology in every detail, was utterly aghast at this way in which the secular authority should be used to perform an act of judicial murder, even upon a heretic. And Martin excommunicated all the other bishops who'd been involved in the process. That's my favourite Martin story, understanding that the authority that God gives us is not based upon the way we can leverage it with a secular authority that may steal our soul in the context of the negotiation or the trade-off we make with them. So, yes, that was me saying we have something to learn from the church of the 4th century, which I did go and spend those years learning to go back and teach. But I've got one more 4th, or perhaps it's really a 5th century story for you. In the year 410, Alaric the Goth sacked the city of Rome. This was a cataclysmic event in terms of politics and religion and everything else, because of course Rome had become Christian just a matter of decades before. And the Christian people of the Roman Empire were thinking the moral arc of the universe had done exactly the right thing for them, right? And then in 410, Alaric sacks Rome, and the sort of pagans still hanging out saying, yeah, look what this Christian God can do and can't do. And the greatest result for Christianity from Alaric's sack of Rome was Augustine of Hippo's writing of the City of God, which is the only robust theology of history the Christian church has ever come up with, and because of that is routinely ignored by the Christian church as it thinks about history. Because we all seem to be in the game of saying, well, yeah, God did this and God did that and God did the other, and Augustine says, you have no clue. You have no clue what God is up to in the present. What you do have a clue about is that God is up to it. Augustine said that Scripture gave us a sense of what was going on because of its prophetic nature during the events to which Scripture itself refers. But we've entered into a period at the end of the formation of Scripture which he called the saeculum. Saeculum is, of course, the Latin word from which we get secular. Augustine argued that we'd entered into this place where we did not have the power to discern what was authentic, what was divine, and what was not, and that we would continue to experience as we travel along as God's people in a community and society which is not necessarily all made of God's people or friendly to God and God's people, that we would experience what we would actually have to call a kind of agnosticism about the state of history and God's place in history, not because we had an agnosticism about God's self, far from it. We do have the capacity to know when God has shown up, but it's not because the graphs ticked up the right way. God has shown up when love is shown authentically. God has shown up when justice is genuinely done. God has shown up when people respond to the gospel in faith and hope, knowing the depth of the repentance that we must undergo and the heights to which God may call us by the power of the Spirit. Augustine then left the City of God sort of to posterity. His own church the trend went to zero. The only Christians in Hippo today are a handful of French missionaries who keep alive a church that was planted in the 19th century because, of course, the Hipponian church was destroyed first by Arian heretics who invaded, and then subsequently by the Arab conquests of the late 6th, early 7th centuries. And yet, we know that Augustine kept the faith. And it wasn't because of the graphs. And yet, that faith has real significance for us even today. Our first call then, friends, is to be faithful. And if we are faithful, then God will ultimately look after the graphs. But being faithful means being concerned that we spread the gospel, that we form Christian community which is authentic, that we do reach out to others, that we act with compassion and charity, that we have confidence that the reason that we are doing this and the thing for which we look for and call success is what happens at the end. The moral arc is not necessarily an arc as we would probably understand it, but history is God's history. Time is God's time. The church is God's church. Let us acknowledge, accept, and celebrate that fact and go on in faith and hope together. Thank you.